Empires used to collapse one at a time. Today, three are approaching the same stage simultaneously. Spain, Britain, and the USSR didn't look like they were collapsing until they were already finished. The music kept playing right up until someone noticed the orchestra pit was empty. Now Japan, China, and Europe are quietly crossing into stage 5, the point where collapse stops being theory and starts being felt. Japan's debt exceeds 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. China's property bubble is evaporating middle-class wealth while youth unemployment surges. Europe's youth unemployment sits at 14.8%, with entire southern regions hemorrhaging talent to the north. If you've ever wondered why prices keep rising, savings feel weaker, and every recovery feels faker than the last, this is for you. Because once a system reaches stage 5, the script almost never rewinds. This isn't prophecy. It's pattern recognition across 5 centuries of financial history. Every empire that collapsed followed the same 7-stage sequence, not because leaders were evil, but because the promises outgrew the reality, and no one wanted to be the one to say enough. Spain mined a mountain of silver and still went bankrupt 4 times. Britain controlled a quarter of the planet and couldn't afford its own power. The Soviet Union didn't default on its debt. It defaulted on reality itself. But what no one tells you is that 3 of today's safest-looking economies, Japan, China, and Europe, are quietly stepping into the same trap at stage 5. To see why, we need to go back, not to Rome or to America, but to the moment every empire thinks it's still safe. Stage 1 is military and economic overreach. Empires expand beyond their capacity to sustain, funding wars or projects that promise returns but deliver only obligations. Stage 2 brings currency and monetary distortion. When tax revenue can't cover spending, governments debase currency, print money, or manipulate interest rates. Stage 3 is the debt spiral. Borrowing becomes permanent. Debt compounds. Interest payments consume more of the budget than actual services. Stage 4 reveals loss of productive capacity. The real economy, the part that makes things people need, stagnates or shrinks while financial assets inflate. Stage 5 is social and institutional fracture. Trust breaks down. People stop believing the system can deliver on its promises. Youth unemployment rises. Emigration accelerates. Extremism grows. Stage 6 arrives with loss of confidence and status. Markets, allies, and citizens stop treating the currency or bonds as safe. Capital flees. The empire loses its seat at the table. Stage 7 is the sudden reset or collapse. Sometimes it's a currency crisis. Sometimes it's political disintegration. Sometimes it's both. But it's always faster than anyone expected. Most people only feel stages 4 and 5 when their lives get harder, but by then, the math has already been written. And that's exactly where Japan, China, and Europe are drifting now, each for a different reason. Spain had the closest thing to infinite money and still went broke 4 times in 40 years. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors discovered a mountain in Bolivia so rich with silver it was called Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. Ships loaded with silver crossed the Atlantic, flooding Spain with wealth. The empire expanded across Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines. It looked unstoppable, but the silver created a hidden trap. Prices in Spain began rising faster than anywhere else in Europe, what historians call the price revolution. A Spanish merchant could buy flour one year, and the next year, with the same amount of silver, afford only half as much. The influx of precious metals didn't create prosperity, it created inflation. Worse, Spain was fighting wars on multiple fronts. The Habsburgs were battling France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. Every campaign drained the treasury. Even mountains of silver couldn't keep pace. So Spain borrowed, from Italian bankers, from German financiers, from anyone who would lend. And then Spain did the unthinkable. In 1557, the crown declared bankruptcy, defaulting on its loans. Then again in 1575, and 1596, and 1607. Each time, the empire promised reform. Each time, it repeated the cycle. For ordinary people, it didn't feel like collapse. It felt like always being one step behind your own life. Wages rose, but prices rose faster. Savings eroded. Trust in institutions crumbled. Spain had infinite silver. It still fell into stage 5 and never climbed back out. Britain read Spain's obituary and still chose the same pattern. At its peak, Britain controlled a quarter of the planet and still couldn't afford its own power. In 1914, the British Empire was the world's financial center. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. London's banks financed trade from Shanghai to Sao Paulo. Britain's navy ruled the seas. Then came World War I. The cost was staggering, not just in lives, but in gold. Britain borrowed heavily from the United States to fund the war effort. By 1918, the empire had won the war but lost its balance sheet. Exports fell 25% below pre-war levels. Imports remained high. The trade deficit had to be financed with borrowing, and lenders demanded repayment in gold, not paper. The pound, once the world's safest currency, became a liability. In 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard. Sterling lost 25% of its value against the dollar overnight. Savers who had trusted the empire's promise of stability watched their wealth evaporate. After World War II, Britain was technically on the winning side, but financially, it was broken. The empire dismantled piece by piece. India gained independence. The Suez Crisis in 1956 exposed Britain's inability to act without American approval. By the 1970s, the UK was asking the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. Empire didn't end in a single battle. It ended in small, quiet confiscations of trust, devaluations, inflation, broken promises. For a British saver in the 1940s, it felt like the system was slowly stealing their future, 1 percentage point at a time. Then came a superpower that didn't just lose an empire. It lost its entire system almost overnight. The Soviet Union didn't default on its debt the way Spain did. It defaulted on reality. Through the 1980s, the USSR was the world's second superpower. It had nuclear weapons, a space program, and an empire stretching from Berlin to Vladivostok. On paper, production was growing. In practice, the system was rotting. The Soviet economy couldn't produce enough consumer goods. Stores had empty shelves. Bread, cigarettes, basic necessities, all rationed. Meanwhile, people's monetary income grew by 17% in 1990 and 43% in the first half of 1991. The currency in their pockets was worthless because there was nothing to buy. It was inflation without prices officially rising, just shortages getting worse. Factories were producing, but they were producing the wrong things. Intermediate goods piled up and used while finished consumer products disappeared. The system had no way to adjust because there were no market signals, no alternative suppliers, no flexibility. One factory's disruption cascaded through the entire economy. When people stop believing tomorrow will be better, a country's balance sheet is already broken. By 1991, citizens had stopped pretending. The USSR dissolved not because of a military defeat, but because the economic fiction collapsed under its own weight. The same superpower that launched Sputnik couldn't keep bread on the shelves. So what happens when modern economies repeat old mistakes, with bigger numbers and less room to maneuver? Japan is what a polite collapse looks like. No riots on TV, just 30 years of quietly shrinking opportunity. In 1989, Japan looked unstoppable. Tokyo's real estate was valued higher than all of California. Then the bubble burst. Stock and real estate prices collapsed. And 3 decades later, they still haven't recovered. Japan entered stage 1 with economic overreach, an asset bubble inflated by cheap credit and speculation. Stage 2 followed immediately. The Bank of Japan slashed interest rates, eventually pushing them to zero, then negative. It didn't work. Stage 3 locked in. Debt became permanent. Today, Japan's government debt sits at over 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. Stage 4 is demographic, loss of productive capacity. Japan loses 600,000 to 700,000 people every year. Nearly 30% of the population is over 65. Schools close. Towns empty out. The workforce shrinks while the number of retirees grows relentlessly. Productivity can't keep up with the obligations. And now stage 5, social fracture. For young Japanese workers, the script is bleak. Do everything right, study hard, get into a good university, land a stable job, and still face a lifetime of stagnation. Fertility rates hit record lows. More people die than are born. The social contract, work hard and prosper, feels like a lie told by a previous generation. This is what collapse looks like when it's slow enough to feel normal. The bond market stays calm. Inflation remains low, but opportunity quietly drains away. A 25-year-old in Tokyo today will never experience the economic growth their grandparents took for granted. Japan is trapped in stage 5, and there's no clear path forward. But another giant is facing stage 5 for the opposite reason. Not too little growth, but too much, too fast, on unstable foundations. China did in 40 years what took Britain 150 years. History never gives that kind of speed without a bill. In 1980, China was a poor, isolated agricultural society. By 2020, it was the world's second-largest economy, the manufacturing hub of the planet, and a serious rival to American power. No nation in history had ever industrialized so quickly, but that speed came with structural distortions. China's growth model relied on massive infrastructure investment and real estate development. For 2 decades, it worked. Cities rose from farmland. Highways connected distant provinces. Housing prices soared. The middle class built wealth by buying apartments, sometimes 2 or 3, purely as investments. Then the model hit its limits. By 2025, China's property bubble is collapsing. Beijing's second-hand home prices are falling 1.1% per month. Entire developments sit unfinished, ghost cities where no one lives. Middle-class families who sank their savings into real estate are watching their wealth evaporate. Consumption is collapsing. Youth unemployment is surging. Social trust is unraveling. China is moving through the stages at compressed speed. Stage 1. Economic overreach through Belt and Road. Overcapacity in manufacturing and property sector overbuilding. Stage 2. Monetary expansion through shadow banking and local government financing vehicles. Stage 3. Debt spiraling at the local government level, where officials borrowed against land sales that no longer generate revenue. Stage 4. Productivity decline as resources were misallocated into empty buildings instead of genuine innovation. Now Stage 5. Young people are giving up on the megacities. In the past, success meant Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, or Shenzhen. Today, burned out by hypercompetitiveness, stagnant wages, and unaffordable housing, young Chinese are fleeing to second-tier cities like Chengdu, Changsha, and Chongqing. They re-choosing a slower pace and mental well-being over the promise of wealth that increasingly feels like a mirage. When a society is told everything is fine while everyone feels it isn't, that's stage 5 territory. The gap between official narratives and lived reality grows unbridgeable. Trust erodes. People hedge. Capital, if it can, finds an exit. And yet, there's one region whose collapse no one wants to believe is possible, because it is supposed to be the safe alternative to America. Europe looks stable, until you remember that one currency is trying to hold together dozens of different economies. The European Union and the Eurozone were designed to prevent another continental war. In that, they succeeded. But economically, the single currency created a trap. Germany's export-driven economy benefits from a weaker euro. Southern Europe's tourism and agriculture sectors suffer from being unable to devalue their own currencies. The result? Youth unemployment at 14.8% across the EU, but the pain isn't evenly distributed. In southern nations like Greece, Italy, and Spain, entire generations are underemployed or emigrating. A 25-year-old graduate in Athens can't find professional work at home, so they move to Berlin, Amsterdam, or London, draining talent from the periphery to the core. Europe is advancing through the stages unevenly. Stage 1. Geopolitical and social overreach. Expanding the union faster than institutions could integrate, promising generous welfare states without the growth to fund them. Stage 2. The European Central Bank's interventions, negative interest rates, and quantitative easing. Stage 3. Sovereign debt crises, Greece, Italy, Portugal, requiring bailouts that created resentment in the north. Stage 4. Industrial decline in some member states, compounded by energy shocks and over-reliance on Russian gas. Stage 5 is fragmentation. North versus South resentment deepens. Populist parties gain strength by promising exits from the Union or defiance of Brussels. Protests erupt in France. Italy's government clashes with EU fiscal rules. Trust between member states frays. The EU remains intact, for now, but the centrifugal forces are growing. Stage 5 doesn't always mean revolution. Sometimes it just means nobody trusts anybody, markets, media, or ministers. And when trust disappears, the math stops matching. Perception becomes reality. So what happens when Japan, China, and Europe all flirt with stage 5 at the same time, while the dollar system is already strained? In past collapses, capital could run somewhere safer. What if the next stage 5 is global, with nowhere left to hide? Spain collapsed while Britain rose. Britain declined while America ascended. The USSR fell while the West celebrated. There was always a lifeboat. But today, the three largest non-US economies, Japan, China, and Europe, are all entering stage 5 together. If Japan's bond market cracks, global pension funds holding Japanese debt face losses. If China's property sector fully implodes, commodity exporters from Australia to Brazil lose their largest customer. If Europe fragments, the world's second-largest economic bloc destabilizes, sending shockwaves through trade and currency markets. These systems are interconnected. Japanese investors hold European bonds. Chinese factories supply European consumers. European banks have exposure to Asian markets. A crisis in one region doesn't stay contained. It amplifies through cross-border holdings, currency swaps, trade dependencies, and confidence contagion. The danger isn't one collapse. It's several slow collapses reinforcing each other. A shock in China weakens demand for Japanese exports, forcing the Bank of Japan to print more, devaluing the yen, triggering inflation in import-dependent Japan. Meanwhile, European banks with exposure to Asian debt face write-downs, tightening credit, deepening the EU's stagnation. Feedback loops, once triggered, are hard to stop. And when safe havens disappear, investors don't know where to run. Gold, Bitcoin, dollars, each has limits. Each has risks. The assumption that somewhere will always be stable starts looking naive. But while governments deny the pattern, some investors and families are already acting as if stage 5 is here. Stage 5 isn't just about numbers. It's about how people cope when they realize the game is rigged, but can't leave the table. In 1970s Britain, as inflation ate savings and the pound devalued, families quietly moved money offshore if they could. Those who couldn't watch their purchasing power drain away. In late Soviet Russia, people hoarded goods because rubles were useless. Cigarettes, vodka, canned food, anything tangible became a better store of value than the currency. Today, in Japan, young people aren't getting married or having children because they can't afford the future they were promised. In China, middle-class families are desperately trying to move wealth abroad, but capital controls make it nearly impossible. In Europe, talented young workers are emigrating from south to north, and from the EU to the US, Canada, or Australia. These behaviors reveal the psychology of stage 5. Trust decay becomes an invisible balance sheet loss. Institutions still exist. Elections still happen. But no one believes the system can fix itself. Politicians change, but trajectories don't. Once people stop believing the system can repair itself, stage 6 is an emotional decision before it's a financial one. The collapse becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because the numbers force it, but because confidence vanishes. So if Japan, China, and Europe are at or near stage 5, what comes next for individuals who see it early? In every collapse, a small minority didn't just survive, they quietly positioned themselves decades in advance. In 16th century Spain, the savvy merchants didn't keep their wealth in silver. They bought land in other countries or invested in trade networks that extended beyond Spanish control. In 1920s and 1930s Britain, those who saw the writing on the wall moved assets to America or the Commonwealth before the pound's devaluations. In the late Soviet Union, the nomenclatura and well-connected families began converting influence into hard assets before 1991. Those who did became oligarchs. Those who didn't lost everything. History suggests a few common strategies. Hard assets, land, gold, productive businesses tend to hold value when currencies lose credibility. Geographic diversification protects against single-country risk. Skill mobility, having expertise that translates across borders, gives you options when staying put becomes dangerous. Currency hedging, whether through foreign bank accounts or alternative stores of value, provides a buffer. But these strategies require foresight. By the time stage 6 arrives, when everyone panics, borders close, capital controls tighten, and exits disappear. The window is narrow. The system wants you to believe you're powerless. History suggests you're not. but only if you act before stage 6. Because the real question isn't whether systems collapse, it's who writes the next one. Japan, aging plus debt. 30% of the population over 65, government debt at 260% of GDP, and 30 years of stagnation. The weight is crushing, slowly, quietly. China, property plus trust. Ghost cities, evaporating middle-class wealth, youth unemployment surging, and a government insisting everything is under control while everyone knows it isn't. Europe, fragmentation plus demographics. Youth unemployment, North-South resentment, industrial decline, and an energy crisis that exposed the continent's dependence on external powers. 3 regions. 3 versions of the same stage. 1 global financial system connecting them all. The math is interlocking. The risks are synchronized. The outcomes are unpredictable, but the pattern is not. So what happens when the world's backup plans start failing at the same time? The crisis doesn't start where you live. It starts in numbers you never see and ends in prices you can't ignore. When Japan's bond yields rise because investors lose confidence, pension funds worldwide take losses. When China's property sector collapses, commodity prices fall, hitting exporters in Latin America, Africa, and Australia. When Europe's banks face write-downs, credit tightens globally, choking investment and growth. Corporate balance sheets are exposed. Multinational companies with supply chains running through China face disruption. Automakers dependent on European consumers see demand crater. Tech firms relying on Japanese components face shortages or price spikes. Reserve currency debates accelerate. If the yen, yuan, and euro all weaken simultaneously, the dollar strengthens. But that creates its own problems. A strong dollar makes American exports uncompetitive and increases the debt burden for emerging markets that borrowed in dollars. The global system, built on the assumption that some major currencies will always be stable, starts looking fragile. And as financial stress spreads, political extremes rise. Protests, nationalism, scapegoating. Governments respond with controls, capital controls, currency restrictions, censorship. The soft authoritarianism of financial pressure. And yet, history suggests this isn't just an ending, it's a reset. Empires don't die because people are evil. They die because the promises outgrow the reality, and no one wants to be the one to say enough. Spain promised eternal wealth from New World silver. Britain promised global dominance sustained by the pound. The Soviet Union promised a workers' paradise built on central planning. All 3 delivered, for a time. Then the gap between promise and reality grew too wide to bridge. Japan promised lifetime employment and rising living standards. China promised that hard work and real estate would create middle-class wealth. Europe promised that a single currency and open borders would deliver prosperity and peace. The promises weren't lies when they were made. They just couldn't be kept forever. Your power isn't in predicting the exact date of collapse. No one can do that. Markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent, and systems can limp along in stage 5 for years, even decades. Japan has been there for 30 years and counting. Your power is in recognizing when your country is drifting into stage 5 denial, when the official narrative and lived reality no longer align, when fixes become more desperate, when trust quietly erodes. Maybe the real collapse is end of countries, but of the belief that any single system can stay safe forever. History doesn't repeat, but it echoes. And right now, those echoes are louder than they've been in generations. If Japan, China, and Europe are really entering stage 5, which region do you think reaches stage 6 first, and why? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into how money, power, and history collide, subscribe to Finance Evidence so you don't miss any of our videos.